Charles Tilley said that that a repertoire is like a good jazz piece, that you've got a basic melody, and then you have riffs and development within that melody. So Professor Isaac gave us a nice examination, a fine-grained examination of the tactical development within a repertoire, and some important lessons there in thinking about nonviolent repertoire and challenging extremely repressive situations. Of course, the Southern Civil Rights Movement is in the United States. One of the themes that we'll be developing in the conference is democracies and non-democracies, a particularly poignant topic these days, and what to do about that. So in that context, I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Professor Dana Moss from the University of Pittsburgh. Dana is a rising star in the study of social movements and protest. I hope I don't embarrass her by saying that, but it's true. And I came to be aware of her work with an excellent article that appeared in Mobilization a few years ago. She is a specialist in the Arab Spring mobilizations. She's currently at the University of Pittsburgh. Did I say that? But also a shop of social movement and protest studies, but came out of another one, that is UCI, up the freeway, and we have a few people from UCI as well. Already in her career, she's published in Social Forces and ASR, in Mobilization and Social Forum, Sociological Forum. Yeah, so those are good measures of her intellect and her analytical abilities. She's also been targeted or picked to contribute to these Blackwell companions, Oxford companions, also measures of how your colleagues think of you. So it's my real pleasure to introduce Dana Moss, who will be talking about mobilization, nonviolent mobilization in under conditions of repression. Go ahead. Thank you.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm so delighted to be here. Bear with me as I pull it up. Okay, so my talk today is called Bound by the Red Lines, the Perils and Promises of Moderate Mobilization under Authoritarianism. And thank you, Hank, so much for having me, and to all the sponsors and supporters of this event. Hank asked me to speak a little bit more about some research and fieldwork I'd done in the Middle East a few years ago, so that's what I'm going to do today. Should be just 20 minutes, as I was told I had. Okay, so revolutionary social movements that emerge to contest dictatorships captivate us. They are exciting. They signify that something new is happening, and because they signify new hope for liberal social change in places where we would think that these were maybe impossible. And as we witnessed during the Arab Spring, mass movements chanting "the people want the fall of the regime" challenged long-standing views that we've had of these masses as apathetic and regimes as unshakable. But mobilization in authoritarian states is often far less disruptive and more routine than expected, and particularly in what I'm going to refer to today as liberalized authoritarian contexts. Liberalized authoritarian regimes, which include hybrid regimes, competitive authoritarian regimes, electoral authoritarian regimes, and the like, are different than your sort of classic totalitarian types because they've opened up limited opportunities for political and civic collective action. So for example, that was early. In the Kingdom of Jordan, which is the case I'm going to be talking about today, liberalization has given rise to political parties and lower-level elections. It's given rise to an absolute proliferation of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and also relatively routine and peaceful protest. So the rise of this regime type, liberalized authoritarianism, in recent decades, and particularly since the fall of the Soviet Union, has spurred a great deal of debate as to what the prospects are for meaningful social change from the bottom up in these types of states. On the one hand, scholars argue that permitted forms of mobilization in these contexts, and particularly in the Middle East, actually contribute to authoritarianism because political parties and NGOs and protests are only permitted to operate in ways that legitimize authoritarian regimes and uphold this facade of democracy. So accordingly, any civic action that's permitted and legal is also censored, it's co-opted, and it's controlled from the top down. So as such, activism is undertaken by these moderates who indirectly and directly accommodate and contribute to the hegemony. So in all, these scholars argue that the prospect for moderate mobilizers to challenge regimes in any meaningful way is quite dim, because activists are bound by what they call the red lines. And red lines here refer to tactics and topics that are considered off limits by authorities. Red lines often render calling for democratic change or enacting a truly disruptive protest as off limits. On the other hand, other scholars, and particularly those studying resistance in China in the post-Tiananmen student movement era, find that moderate activists do not actually operate within a very tightly co-opted or safe civic arena governed according to a clear set of rules set on by authoritarian regimes. Instead, they find that as state officials attempt to enact this paradox that is liberalized authoritarianism, the red lines denoting what activists can say and do at any given time are opaque, they're ever-changing, and they're inconsistently enforced between different authorities within the regime. So this means that moderate activists often tread on the red lines accidentally, which makes their work far riskier than outside researchers often assume. And though these activists are technically or generally loyal to the state, they are also often surprisingly confrontational when it comes to dealing with authorities. And their claims and tactics often span the boundary between strictly contained and riotously disruptive collective action. And protest scholar Kevin O'Brien describes this in the Chinese case quite wonderfully. So this suggests that moderates may actually have the potential to gain concessions and refute the red lines in these contexts. So here I take up this debate and I investigate this regarding activism in the Kingdom of Jordan to ask, is moderate activism actually bound by the red lines, as so many scholars of contention in the Middle East say? Or is it boundary spanning, as scholars of contention in China have found? And if the latter, what are the perils and promises of moderate mobilization in a liberalized authoritarian state? So to address these questions, I take up the case of Jordan, as I mentioned, which liberalized gradually after martial law was lifted in 1989. At the same time, King Abdullah II, who's pictured here, retains broad powers to govern by decree, appoint all higher level officials, and he's forbidden from being criticized in law. Freedom House reports that those who violate the red lines regarding the royal family in word or deed face arrest or worse. The intelligence apparatus, al-Mukhabarat, infamously and widely interferes in civic life and politics to enforce the red lines. The rules governing elections and NGOs, which NGOs are allowed to operate, are also unfree and unfair. And though demonstrations are technically legal, protesters are sometimes referred to the semi-military tribunal state security court for high crimes of treason or criminality. So this is an ideal case to investigate what exactly moderates can say and do under these conditions. It's also an interesting case because according to Freedom House, as you can see here, Jordan's degree of freedom has changed little since they started publishing these figures over the last 20 years and about since when Abdullah II came to power. And Jordan's actually become mostly less free over time, despite this explosion in civil society and party politics. So in order to do this research in 2011, I conducted interviews with 57 reform-oriented activists to understand their grievances and their tactics and their experiences with state repression. And this was a time when the kingdom appeared relatively quiet amidst all the other Arab Spring revolutions that were happening around it. I use snowball sampling in both above-ground social movement networks and NGO networks, which oftentimes overlap. Many activists were involved in all different kinds of activism. And, no, phone action? Okay. And I also interviewed representatives of 4 political parties, including the Muslim Brotherhood's Islamic Action Front. The sample is about 3/4 male, mostly college educated, though respondents represented a wide range of socioeconomic statuses and occupations ranging from super elite to not at all elite. And 70% were under the age of 50. Most people in Jordan are of youthful age demographically. And then I conducted this research also by traveling to 8 different cities in 3 different regions. And Jordan is a small country. It's about the size of Indiana, so it's feasible to do that. And then I coded up all the interview transcripts according to grounded methods, which I can talk about more later if you like, and triangulated activist accounts with media sources whenever that was possible. Okay, so what did I find? Well, first, I found that activists did indeed view themselves as loyal to the regime in general, and they expressed a willingness to compromise with authorities. So during this time of excitement and revolution, 2011 being the most hopeful and exciting year of the Arab Spring, they were very supportive of revolutions happening in Egypt or Tunisia, but did not support the prospect of revolution in Jordan, and they viewed this as undesirable. As one movement organizer explained to me, because it's not a bloody regime, like in Syria and Libya, the people agree that the king should stay the king, and they do not ask for a radical toppling of the regime. Moderates also describe maintaining working relations with state officials as necessary to conduct their work as activists, as civil society actors, and also to conduct this work effectively and in a transparent fashion. So as one NGO director explained to me, the government is targeting any independent organization in order to contain them, but we are serious to have a bridge between us and the government. And then he went on to say that without dialogue with the government, there's no access to information, and you need to develop your relationships with them in order to go in with solid ideas about how to change the laws. Activists and protest movements also expressed a surprising degree of accommodation towards the intelligence agents who were actually sent to their meetings and sent to their protests to observe them and surveil them in person. One protest leader recalled to me, as did many others, "We try not to have any friction with the intelligence agents. We welcome them into our meetings. It's very important to be fair with the intelligence." And many of them thought so because they assumed that the sympathies of the intelligence actually lay with them in terms of their grievances about corruption in the regime. And I can talk about that more later. But the point is that on the surface, activists appeared to be loyal and accommodating, as loyal and accommodating as of the state, as pessimistic accounts of moderate mobilization suggest. However, I also found that all activists routinely adopted topics in their work that were politically sensitive and touched the red lines, as they would tell me. And this included systematic discrimination against Palestinians, human rights abuses in the kingdom, the unfair electoral system, media censorship, Jordan's relations with Israel, privatization of state-owned property, and corruption. So in addition to taking up red line topics, activists also took up boundary-spanning tactics because they considered doing a little bit of troublemaking as an inherent and necessary part of being an activist. As one NGO director told me, there were a lot of abuses by the regime regarding the Palestinians, and we started to work on some topics that they, the authorities, considered as a red line. We crossed the red lines in doing that. Our report was in the media, but the authorities get very sensitive if your criticism comes in a report. And then the authorities actually shut his NGO down after he did this. Activists also described that their peaceful protests spanned the boundaries between contained and transgressive in their demands and in their tactics. As one labor organizer reported, "We instigated an illegal sit-in in front of the parliament and called for the fall of the prime minister's government," and this was years before the Arab Spring, "since they did not respond to our demands for compensation." And I also found that activists were subjected to a range of intermittent types of repression for taking on the red lines. This included having their NGOs closed, being slandered as criminals in the state media, and facing arrest and imprisonment, and general threats and intimidation as well. Moderate mobilization was also risky because activists received conflicting signals about what types of actions on any given day were permissible or not. So for example, a social movement for veterans' welfare crossed a red line by requesting to form a political party, which is a technically perfectly legal thing to do. And this really surprised the leader of this group because the political party that he proposed to establish was explicitly intended to, quote, give power to the state, to the regime, to the monarchy, as a supportive entity. So after the leaders of this movement received permission directly from the king himself in a meeting to form this party, the leaders were then summoned to the offices of the intelligence and told that, look, the king may have another point of view, but it's not possible to approve this. And I, the respondent, said frankly that this party is to be established in the face of the Brotherhood. And the officer said back to me, the Muslim brothers, we know how to control, but you we do not know how to control. So even explicitly loyalist forms of mobilization were sometimes perceived by varying members of the regime and the security apparatus as having subversive implications. And in this case, thanks to their efforts, these movement leaders were then referred to the state security court on trumped-up charges of treason and other criminal allegations. Activists also strategically threatened to cross the red lines in order to create what Michael Lipsey has famously called a negative inducement to bargaining. Activists and NGOs, for example, recognized that the regime was sensitive for having its, quote, dirty laundry aired in public because they were often getting punished for doing just that. So they sometimes threatened officials with the prospect of publishing a report in order to get what they wanted from the regime. So an NGO head told me, I say to the intelligence, I have complaints, but I don't want to go to the media or advocate against you. Please try to solve this problem. And that's how we start off, using the soft way. If they have respect for what we say, then that's it. We've accomplished what we need to do. But if they don't discuss with us, we use the hard way, using the media, making statements. And correspondingly, a leader in a movement to form a teachers' association, or what we would call a union, also described that they exploited regime concerns about a mass uprising to gain concessions from the state. She told me that, the intelligence were saying that forming this association, it's unconstitutional. So we were saying, why not amend the Constitution? It's a red line. We can make it not a red line. And we threatened to strike across the country and join the popular movements for reform. And the government then made the wise decision to give us our association. And I also found that in 2011, again, the first year of the Arab Spring, that one of the most notable ways that activists were pushing back against the red lines was to openly criticize the royal family. This was a big deal. So even though Jordan appeared to be relatively insulated from the effects of the Arab Spring happening around it, activists nevertheless reported that they were pushing for changes in ways that they considered to be unthinkable even 3 to 6 months before. One movement organizer described that in the street and in general meetings, the people are talking about the king and queen in ways that cross all the red lines. They're saying, for example, that the constitution of the second Abdullah needs to be changed. Before, they said the constitution coming by decree of His Royal Majesty, King Abdullah II, and so on. Another told me that upon joining a protest in the small Jordanian city of Kerak, which is outside of the capital of Amman, we saw crowds of people gathered, and they were throwing tomatoes at the mayor's office. There was a much higher ceiling to their slogans than we had accepted before. They chanted, prices are higher than fire, Abdullah is gambling, and they played on the slogan of the Arab Spring, the people demand reform, or we will finish the slogan with the fall of the regime. Organizers also described the fact that they had begun to challenge the king's practice of bestowing gifts to Jordanians as subjects rather than rights to Jordanians as citizens. One protest organizer told me, we have started to be more accurate and clear in our callings. We used to say, long live the king. Now it's long live the Jordanian people. And that health and education are our fundamental rights. They're not a gift from anyone. And this activist gleefully described how she had distributed stickers saying this across the country, and she slapped one on the table, which is pictured here at the bottom, for me to take home, which I did. Activists also demanded that the king stop blaming other parts of the security apparatus or parts of the government for failures of reform in Jordan and be accountable for implementing reform himself. An NGO leader who also participated in many pro-reform demonstrations and pro-Palestinian actions exclaimed, all the problems we face are from the regime, the king. If he is the king and he wants democratic reform as he claims, and the government doesn't want it or is very slow to implement reform, okay, kick them out. You, the king, have the power. If you say that the director of the intelligence is wrong, okay, kick him out. Look, either the king is able and he doesn't want to make these changes, or he is unable. And that means he's not really the king. And this makes people think, if he is unable, why do we have to keep him? But at the same time, it's important to clarify that these criticisms were lodged in the spirit of stabilizing the monarchy rather than overturning it. As one movement leader explained, in order to protect the king and preserve the system, the king's powers need to be reduced. Another told me that we want him to stay the king. However, we want to be ruled by civilized rules and laws. And he should send corrupt officials to the court, because otherwise his reputation is under discussion with the Jordanian people. So in all, activists professed criticism, but in the spirit of loyalty, but we're still engaged in this dynamic process of contesting the red lines. So in conclusion, is moderate mobilization bound by the red lines? Is it antithetical to meaningful change in the kingdom? So I argue that in the case of Jordan, the answer is definitely no. Moderates may be loyal, and they are anti-revolution, but they are not co-opted or easily controlled by the state. Instead, the degree of risk they undertake to engage in civic and political action is higher and often much less predictable than outside researchers and observers have assumed. And their boundary-spanning actions also strategically exploit regime sensitivities to public shaming and mass disruption, and they threaten to cross red lines as a negative inducement to bargaining. So by 2011, this had resulted in an unprecedented degree of public criticism of the royal family happening in coffee shops, in taxi cabs, and on the street that breached what was considered to be the highest taboo in the kingdom. And this is really important because through this process, moderates refuted their subjecthood, they enacted the citizenship that had been promised to them, but was not guaranteed in law, and they pressured the regime to live up to its own stated promises of reform. And this has a few implications that I'll discuss briefly. First, formal liberalization creates a political opportunity for activism, unquestionably. But we should also remember that activists must continuously undertake risks in order to determine whether formal opportunities are actually being upheld by these regimes from one day to the next. And this is because authorities vacillate between being more or less tolerant as they work to walk this fine line and maintain this paradox that is liberalized authoritarianism. And correspondingly, this study and others demonstrate that tactical combat is occurring continuously around the red lines as activists fight to win concessions and then regimes try to mobilize to contain their critics. During periods when regimes are facing pressure to diffuse protest and maintain stability, as Jordan did during the Arab Spring, activists can therefore push back against the red lines further to gain new ground. But I would also expect that during periods of increased repression, these activists are really important because they're the ones who are on the front lines working to defend hard-won gains that were won in the past. And we're seeing this now play out in the case of civil society activists in Russia and the Philippines and elsewhere recently. So in all, mass disruption is not the only viable means of change in unfree contexts. And I would argue that far from being dupes or sellouts, moderates can make important gains that set new precedents and reshape normative political practices. So moderate mobilization, therefore, warrants our attention as much as the revolutions that unfold alongside them, as well as further comparative and, importantly, cross-regional research. Thank you very much.